Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Lacy by the Silvery Moonlight by BearLair64. By the light of the silvery moon, I want to croon to my honey about who loves whom. Sorry, Bear, that's all you get. I finished the old tune and stared down lovingly into Lacy's wide brown eyes. She gave me a big smile and wiggled in delight. We both enjoyed the early summer evening on the front porch. Indeed, by the light of the silvery moon. I stroked her back and cuddled her close. In so short a time she'd become a true delight in my life. Dogs have a way of doing that. Oh, you thought she was a woman or a girl? Well, that's okay. So did she. Her life had been hard up to the point when the folks at the local animal shelter had ended up with her. She was a medium to large mixed breed, plenty of golden retriever in that mix by the look of her, and trending towards the larger end of the scale. A little russet in the coat and a slightly pointed nose, maybe some Irish setter? She was still young enough to be a little fuzzball, but was starting to look like a real dog, a grown-up. Okay, an adolescent. She had plenty of energy and was clearly very bright. It hadn't taken long to house-train her, and she could already sit and stay. She was kind enough to tolerate me singing old songs as we puttered about my place and wasted time. The life of the newly retired. I loved animals, but hadn't wanted any when I retired. I felt like I'd be traveling or working on projects, and wouldn't have time to properly care for one. Then I stopped by the shelter to visit and ogle Ms. Wanda Jameson. We'd met elsewhere, but she told me where she worked and invited me to visit. Next thing I knew, I had Lacy and a complete setup for a new pup, and Wanda trundled me out to my truck without so much as a by your leave, here's my number, or kiss my foot. Women. But my Lacy was loyal. A scratch on the rump, just above the tail, and another behind the ears, and she was mine for the day. Okay, at least for the moment. Pooches sometimes have short memories. I hadn't realized until Lacy arrived, and I had started to share my home with another living being, just how lonely I'd become. Sure, I had my fun with the old gals around town, but I hadn't looked at any of them seriously. My wife had died many years previously. We'd had no children, and without her, well, life could be empty at times. She was still the other half of my internal dialogue. Now I had a sweet little lady to take on walks, one who wouldn't fuss at me or argue when I griped about politics, and one who liked me singing old songs as much as my Rhonda had. Life with Lacy was good. That moon sure was bright. It was full. Gibbous, as folks used to say. Bright enough that I decided that we could take a walk through the yard, let my little critter relax and enjoy the great outdoors before we headed inside for bed. Not like we had to get up and do anything. Lacy sniffed and gambled and rooted her nose under every bush and tree with the tirelessness of youth. I envied her for a moment. Then she started getting close to the woods near the edge of the property. We had paper company-owned forests on both sides. They extended for miles. Never knew what might be lurking under those branches. Maybe this wasn't a good idea. Didn't want my girl to encounter a copperhead or other nasty concealed in the moon shadows. I called to her. "Lacy, come back here." "Good girl, come on." Naturally, she decided she didn't want to be a good girl. Or maybe she was just too excited by the things she smelled. So she kept at it for a moment, then abruptly halted in her tracks. She looked up and out into the forest and gave a little not a bark, just a startled, defensive sound. She started for another moment, then bolted towards the trees. "Lacy!" I called in vain. "Get back here!" I was suddenly afraid. What if she'd taken off after a coyote or a wild dog, or worse yet, a feral hog? Those things were dangerous to full-grown dogs. Lacy was still a pup. I hadn't planned on the walk, so I didn't have a flashlight or a walking stick, and had nothing on my feet but flip-flops. But I ran after her, heedless of what was sure to happen to my feet on the rough forest floor. Then I heard her yelp. The sound was engulfed by a deep-throated growl, not Lacy's. It was a yelp of pain and fear, and she wasn't too far ahead. I heard the sound of rustling brush as some large animal or person fled from the same direction, far more noise than little Lacy could produce. I found her lying in the roots of an old oak tree, her fur stained with blood, her ribs pumped with heavy breaths, and a slight whimper and whine emanated from her throat. Something large had bitten her along the scruff of her neck and had maybe shaken her. It had to be large. She was nearly 40 pounds. It might have even been a cougar. I was nervous, but otherwise I set aside my major fears and scooped up my little girl and carried her back home. As I hobbled through the last of the trees before my yard, I was startled by the sound of a low-octave howl that rang out through the woods. The challenge of a predator, triumphant over a fresh kill. Maybe Miss Lacy had interfered in the hunt. In any case, some poor creature had just met its end. I got her inside the house and under some clear lighting and examined her. The wounds did not appear to be deep or near anything but vital, but they were already swollen and I could see irritation around each puncture. She'd gone limp and nearly lifeless. Her breathing now slow, like she was in a deep sleep. I wrapped her in a towel and carried her out to the car. I drove the several miles into town and to the veterinarian's office. She lived behind the clinic, and I knew she would take on an emergency case. In our area, those were sick livestock as often as household pets. Poor Dr. Stone had just gone to bed, but she gamely answered my knocks and rings. She escorted Lacy and me to the clinic, and once we were inside, she immediately went to work on the now decidedly limp dog. She shooed me out into the front area and ordered me to make some coffee, since I'd made her get out of bed. I complied and allowed her to do her work. When I looked back in on them, she was putting in some stitches and wore a worried frown. That made me worry. It was a long night. The next morning I was awakened from where I'd stretched out on the sofa in the waiting area by Lacy nosing at me. When I was mostly alert, she gave me her usual effulgent dog smile. I could not understand how such a sweet creature managed to have such hideous breath. Despite my relief and sheer joy, it took me a few minutes to sit up and get my joints to move properly. Well, as properly as they did these days. There she was, perky and goofy as ever, wagging her butt to counter her tail. A new, fragrant face lick got me fully alert and on my feet. Urgh! Gross! I grouched playfully as I attempted to wave away the foul smell. When the doc arrived, I settled the bill with her and thanked her profusely. She seemed surprised that Lacy appeared to be doing so well. I must admit I was worried for her last night. I expected to have her here for a few days, but the punctures look, well, significantly healed. Far more than they should be. She's had her shots, but you'll need to keep an eye on her. No interactions with other animals. She's quarantined for potential rabies exposure. Just a precaution, but please watch her. Oh, and give her these twice a day. Antibiotics. Don't want her getting any nasty infections. As she said the last, she gave Lacy a quick back rub and was rewarded with a wet dog kiss. "Oof! We need to get her in for a teeth cleaning. She's too young to have such awful breath," Dr. Stone exclaimed. So we backed up and headed back to our shanty in the woods. I stopped by the little grocery store in town on the way and picked up some treats for both Lacy and me. We'd had a long night. When we arrived, Lacy hopped out of the truck through the driver's side as usual, too anxious to wait for me to open her side. Yet once she'd bounded out into the yard, she stopped. She tensed and then cowered. Next thing I knew, she was glued to my side. She stayed that way until we got inside. She'd cast nervous glances at the woods as we proceeded across the yard. She definitely remembered what had happened inside the trees. That evening, I gave her the antibiotic pill just before her supper dish. She took it fine and allowed me to inspect her wounds. I was astonished. They had healed and left 4 perfect pink puncture scars, as though they were a couple of weeks old. I rubbed the area, and she didn't seem to feel any pain. She just grinned at me and puffed her foul breath my way. We'd definitely have to visit the doc again for that teeth cleaning. I decided to wait until tomorrow to call for an appointment. I was glad that the wounds were better, but it was weird, and I thought I'd better keep the doc in the loop. I called Dr. Stone's office, and she had an opening the next hour, so I got ready and escorted Lacy back to the truck. She kept eyeing the trees warily and stayed on my leg. She stopped to have a pee. She had been holding it for a while. Apparently, she no longer wished to enter the yard alone. Maybe we'd have to fix that. I couldn't run outside to pee every time she did. Well, if my prostate kept growing, maybe. "Well, Miss Lacy, you seem to be a miracle healer. Is that your true breed?" Miriam Stone spoke engagingly to my pup, who responded with a huff of breath and a goofy grin. "Ugh, we need to clean those teeth ASAP. I have an opening for that Thursday afternoon. Can you bring her?" She glanced over her shoulder at me. I nodded. "Sure, Doc. Let me just check my appointment book." I mimicked flipping through the pages and running down the lines of an imaginary book. "Looks like we're clear. I'm retired, and Lacy hasn't decided what she wants to be when she grows up. She's currently in homeschool." Lacy perked up a little when she heard her name. Over the next few days, Lacy seemed to get much stronger and even fill out some. Doggy growth spurt, apparently, I thought as I watched her sniff around the yard after she did her business. She was still nervous about going far from the house by herself, but she was starting to recover her confidence. I was sure she'd be racing around her territory once more. Her teeth cleaning had been pretty routine. Her breath still reeked, though. The stinkometer readings were much lower. Some dogs just had nasty breath, like some people. I noticed that she preferred the side of the house farthest from the forest of late. She'd occasionally stop, peek around the corner of the house, and sniff the air from the direction of the shadows cast by the great boles and limbs. She was doing that as I watched her. Then came an ear-splitting howl from inside the line, where the shadows were deep and obscured the exact source of the sound. Lacy immediately cowered and then bolted towards the back door to the house. She burst through her doggy door before I could even rise to my feet. There was still some light this evening, and after my rapid beating pulse settled, I followed her into the house. It was time to check out what creature was lurking out there, haunting my home and my one true friend. I went inside and found my poor dog on the couch, burrowed beneath her favorite blanket, shivering with fear rather than cold. I pat where the lump of her back rose slightly under the material. She growled and snapped at me. Fortunately, her head was covered, so she didn't make contact. I drew back my hand, startled, and then realized just how scared she was. had frightened her. I walked over to the hall closet and picked up my 12-gauge. I checked the load and walked back out onto the back porch. I stepped off and headed in the direction from which I heard the howl. I intended to put a stop to whatever beast was hiding out there, menacing my home, frightening my little girl. This time I wore boots, and I was ready to traipse through the brush. I was well armed, and my blood was up enough to stave off the pain from my back and knees, the constant pain from which Lacy distracted me so well. Now it faded into the background, and I was on the hunt. I slowed once. I was through the brush and under the trees. I began to walk quietly, placing the balls of my feet before me. I stopped frequently to listen. There were no sounds. It was eerie. No birds, no rustles, not even the buzzing of insects. I took a whiff when a slight breeze blew through the branches. I retched and bent forward, preparing to give up my lunch. The stench was horribly foul. Death, rot, musk, and something less definable, but similar to a street person who hasn't been able to wash for a few weeks, all combined with wet dog. When I'd recovered from the initial shock of the wretched stench, I looked up towards the source of the odor, and through the leaves and branches of a yelpin, I saw the eyes. Red eyes. Not reflective, but glowing with the inner light of a nighttime predator. They were set higher off the ground than mine, definitely higher than any normal animal. I thought, maybe it's a person in a costume, or using a prop to play some sort of prank? Yet I couldn't shake an overwhelming sense of dread. The features were sharp, a long nose that descended from between luminous eyes, heavy brows or fur around the eyes, like a cap or long messy hair. I strained my eyes to look more closely, yet the rest of the body was stood frozen in place. The figure shifted slightly, as if it read my thoughts, that I wanted. No, I needed a better look. The head lowered, and I saw that it had pointed ears that protruded from either side of its head and swept backwards. Then I saw the mouth, the maw of the monster. It gaped open to display sharply tipped teeth and fangs and seemed to wear a wicked grin, full of malevolence. I shook with fear, but eventually recalled that I held the shotgun. I blinked away my locked, tunneled gaze and raised the stock to my shoulder. As I tucked the butt into my shoulder, in the pocket, I saw that there was nothing ahead of me, nothing hiding behind the yawpin. It had gotten even darker while the creature and I had stood eyeing one another in challenge and fear, respectively. I heard some rustles out in the woods. The smell dissipated. The sound of other creatures returned as though they'd been muted, and then the audio had been switched on again. I backed a few steps, then turned and quickly made my way back to my yard, to the safety of my property, to my girl, Lacy. As I left behind the last of the trees, I saw that more time had passed than I'd realized. It was nearing full-on dark. I felt the need to get into the shelter of my house, so I picked up the pace again, my niece screaming at the effort. As I reached the porch, the howl bellowed forth once more. Once more, just inside the line of trees. The vomit-inducing stench assailed my olfactory senses once more. I scrambled inside, and there was Lacy. She faced the now-closed door, and her best friend, who leaned back against it as though it could stop that thing outside. She lowered her head and growled fiercely, not at all like anything I'd ever heard from her. I soon realized that she did not growl at me, but at whatever was treading on the floorboards of my porch. I stepped away from the door and faced the front windows. all the while shifting the barrel between them, trying to follow the tread of an obviously heavy animal, person, being. I had no idea, but was adamantly sure that I didn't want to know. The screech of razor talons scratched the wood on my front door, sounded, and Lacy let out a bark. The sound caused me to flinch, and against all my years of practice in keeping my finger off the trigger until I was ready to fire, I fired. The boom startled me even more than the bark at the butt of the 12-gauge slammed into my shoulder, and my ears instantly filled and began to ring. The stench of cordite rose from the chamber and the end of the barrel, and for a brief instant overrode the foulness of the monster, as I instinctively used my grip on the forestock to eject the first round and shove it forward to load the next. The first round had been buckshot, and now I had a nice fat hole just above and to the left of the doorknob, where I'd been hovering the barrel. There was a scream of agony and surprise from the front porch, a deep, hoarse sound that hinted of rage-filled pain. Lacy growled and barked, and I could just hear her as my poor damaged ears continued to ring. When did I take off the safety? My mind wondered. The question was irrelevant, but under pressure the mind wanders in many directions at once. As all of these events concurred almost at once, my perceptions were somewhat overwhelmed. Before I had a chance to sort through all of the rubbish of my synapses, the door burst inward, shards of wood and spalls of glass flying haphazardly towards us. I stumbled backwards and all but fell as the huge fur and hair-covered monstrosity raged into my home in a snarling fit of rage. I'd pulled up the muzzle of the shotgun and tucked my face into the crook of my elbow to protect my eyes. Before I could recover enough to get the barrel back online, the beast was upon me. It swatted aside the barrel and its claws raked my arm. Then it raised its other hand to shred me. Before the frightening swift beast could strike again, a reddish-blonde streak shoved past my left shoulder and slammed into the thing's chest. Lacy! Yet it couldn't be Lacy. This animal was much larger and more muscular. The front legs had elongated, and the paws had morphed into clawed hands. The larger home invader gripped Lacy and flung her across the room. She impacted the wall farthest from the front door and slumped onto the floor. I was instantly furious and pulled the buttstock into the center of my chest and fired my next round into the monster's chest, just below the throat. Its response barely registered as I pumped in another round and fired, then another, and then the fifth and final round. These 4 had been rifled slugs. The bipedal big bad werewolf lay sprawled backwards on the floor, its upper body resting on my favorite rocking chair, and bleeding on an afghan my wife had knitted for me. Bastard! Lacy was on it in a moment. Apparently she'd recovered from the stunning wall slam almost immediately. She had the thing supine and was dragging it across the floor towards the front door, her jaws clamped on top of its right shoulder at the neck, and her head worked side to side. When she realized it was no longer alive, she released it. To my astonishment, she drew up onto her hind legs. Her shoulders and chest had become relatively massive. She threw back her head and howled. The roar overcame even the tinnitus from the sound of the 12-gauge rounds. It was the same I'd heard from the woodline, the same as from the now dead fiend lying inside my front door. She slowly lowered her head and looked towards me. She wore a sinister grin that quickly turned to embarrassment. She looked down, clearly abashed, and then sprung through what was left of the front door of our home and ran into the darkness. once again on all fours. I was in too much shock to even shout after her. At that point, I wasn't sure that I wanted her to come back inside. Then the awful odor rose from the carcass in front of me. The creature seemed to melt. The features morphed and collapsed until there was a dead, naked woman stretched out before me. Her hair was long and stringy and dirty. She was hairy from head to toe and filthy. A pile of putrid fur and flesh outlined her corpse. The mass looked like a large dog roadkill that had been run over several times and left to sit in the hot sun for a few days. It smelt like it, too. I realized as I leaned forward and vomited onto the body, adding my own stink. How am I going to explain this? I asked myself as I awaited the deputies. After I'd recovered from the initial shock, I realized that I had a set of claw marks on my left arm and forearm. I'd set the shotgun aside. Definitely didn't want to have that in my hand when rural sheriff's deputies responded to a homicide. It went better, if more strangely than I'd anticipated. I met the deputies outside and pointed toward the dead woman thing. The foulness had driven me out into the fresh night air. I warned the two as they drew their sidearms and stalked into my house. They didn't pay attention, and both quickly fled back out onto the porch, one of them leaning over the far rail to lose his supper. Sorry, dude, I tried to warn you, I thought uncharitably. Eventually they recovered and cleared my home, and I took one statement while the other called in the ambulance crew and used his phone to call their boss. It was going to be another long night. The lead EMS employee looked at my scratches. She let the deputies take a few photos and then bandaged them. Around the gouges, the skin showed definite signs of irritation. Sir, you can drive yourself or we can take you, but you really need to have an ER doc look at them. She glanced at the SO lieutenant to confirm that I would be free to seek treatment. He nodded and stepped forward. Mr. Brooks, Sheriff Scogan and the Justice of the Peace are on the way. Do you think you could wait until they officially clear the scene before you seek treatment? I agreed. The paramedic looked at the lieutenant and then shrugged. Your call, sir. But please, you really need to see someone soon. There will definitely be infection. In fact, I believe there already is. Don't see many that take hold so rapidly. The sheriff himself arrived within a few minutes, with the Justice of the Peace in tow. There was no county coroner or medical examiner in this rural corner of the county. The JP would be there to make a death ruling. Pretty easy. In the time since the deputies arrived, more of the flesh had fallen from the woman's body. No one could or would go near the reeking mass any more than necessary. But when the sheriff and JP viewed the pictures that the first arriving units had taken, they both looked shocked. They looked at each other in silent communication, and then at me. Sheriff Cloud spoke first. Mr. Brooks, just how did you know the lady in question? I peered at him, a little puzzled. Know her? The first time I saw her, she was hiding out in the woods wearing some kind of costume like a werewolf. Next time she burst through my front door and raked me with her talons. He grunted slightly. Was there anyone else here? Anyone who may corroborate your story? I shrugged. Just my dog, Lacy, but she ran off into the trees, likely in fear of the shotgun rounds. She bit that woman, dragged her from where she fell, I added hesitantly. The sheriff glanced at the JP, who nodded her approval. Look, this is clearly a homicide. He quickly raised his hands. Not a murder. Homicide just means that one person killed another. The means and motive provide the category of the homicide and determine whether there was a crime. She clearly burst through your door, and your wounds are obviously defensive. From an investigative standpoint, the DNA will have to corroborate, but at this time it's my call that this was self-defense, and we won't be seeking any criminal charges." He paused and took a breath. "Are you familiar with, or have you ever heard the name Lacy Elbert?" I started at the name and quickly explained. "Lacy's my dog's name. I picked her up at the shelter in town, about a month ago. I don't recall hearing the name Elbert at all. Oh, wait, I think there's a local family by that name, or maybe I read it in the local... Oh, yeah, that's it. There was a story on the hometown news site. Something about her missing, or... No, you were looking for her. She was wanted? Some kind of assault or murder?" "You mean that's her? The same woman?" The pair of public officials paused, and then in unison, like a pair of bobblehead dolls, nodded. The JP took a turn. "We believe that Lacy may have been responsible for killing her parents and boyfriend, and possibly some others. We have we have some evidence to that effect, though we're not really at liberty to discuss it at this time. From your standpoint, I think it's safe to say that you are unlikely to face charges. We still have to complete an investigation, and of course the DA's office will have to review." I barely heard the rest in my rush of relief. It was indeed a long night, and the sun was up before the first final responders left my property. They'd already processed the scene, and just as the first rays of the sun broke the horizon, they carted off the now putrid mass of gunk and bones. The stench was reduced a little. The crime scene team had applied some solutions to the affected area to prevent contamination. That odd, rapid deterioration made it clear that there was something different about this case. I really wanted a shower and a nap before I drove to the ER. I thought that maybe I can get an appointment with my regular doc instead. Then I saw her. My pup, my Lacy, hobbled tiredly from the tree line and towards the house. We would both need a bath. She was filthy, but she looked like her old self, and she perked up a little and gave me a goofy smile as she trotted to my side. Oh, she reeked! I was too tired to make her a bath, so I coaxed her over to the garden hose and washed off most of the gunk. As I rubbed her as clean as I could without shampoo, I noted that she'd developed some serious musculature, and I was sure that she had grown. What crap happening with my dog? I thought worriedly. Once the major chunks were left behind in the yard, and Lacy had a good shake, we went into the house and I took a shower. She was clingy, so I let her join me in the walk-in enclosure, and we both scrubbed with shampoo. I knew she'd make a mess when she got out and shook, but I didn't want her on the furniture or carpet until the dirt and stink were gone. As I bent down to scrub her, she turned and spewed her dragon breath into my face. So much for the too expensive teeth cleaning. Once we were both clean and as dry as we could be, I called my doc and got in the last appointment of the day at 2 p.m. I set the alarm on my phone and then literally crashed into bed. My last thought was that I would need to rent a carpet cleaner. Scratch that. I'd need to get rid of the rug by the front door. Oh, wait. The crime scene tech had taken that for evidence. My last sensation was Lacy snuggling in beside me. She felt warmer than usual, almost like she had a fever. I was running through the forest. My breath was ragged and I was panting. My tongue lolled out of the side of my mouth and drool dripped onto the pine straw below. I looked downward and saw paws. I had paws, and then I smelled something. Normally I would have gagged at the odor, but now it smelled intriguing, even enticing. I ran towards the delectable smell, the smell of blood, the smell of food. I burst through a strand of brush and into a small clearing in a cattle pond. I recognized it. Lacy and I had found it not far into the woods and near an abandoned property next to ours. The carcass of some unfortunate animal lay on the edge of the clearing next to the water. A pair of turkey vultures gnawed at some delectable pieces, but fled when I appeared, all the while issuing a deep growl from deep in my throat. I stalked over to the pond and checked my reflection in the still water to see what I already knew to be. As I lowered my head over the water, I saw pointed ears that swept back above a furry face. And then the alarm sounded. It was time to get up, get dressed, and go see Dr. Castillo. My wounds felt hot and swollen, but I figured it would be best to wait for the doctor to remove the bandages. I didn't check, but I was sure I had a fever. As I passed through the front entrance to my house, no door left, I had to stop and lean over the railing and gag and dry heave for a moment from the rancid stench of death and rot, masked only slightly by a chemical odor. Lacy had accompanied me onto the porch. Not like I could stop her, but I didn't think my doc would like for her to go inside, and I didn't want to leave her in the truck. So I convinced her to go back inside and wait. "It's okay, girl. I'm just going to the next town over. Big city in this part of the world. After I see old grouchy Roberto, I'm sure I'll have to go by the pharmacy. I'll get you some of the treats you like." She listened to me intensely, as though she genuinely understood the words I spoke, not in the silly way dogs seem to understand. She actually grinned and nodded. Then she turned on her heels and walked back inside the house. Apparently the foul odor near the front entrance didn't bother her as she planted her behind on the floor, where the rug and the body had rested. She struck up the doggy seated at the front door, waited patiently pose, and drooled onto the floor a little. I left what was left of the front door ajar. I thought of hanging a sheet or some plastic over it, but I wanted the air to circulate and move more of the stink, and, too, I felt awful. I didn't feel like driving the nearly 40 miles to see my doctor, much less making home repairs, but it was clearly becoming critical. I managed to make it to not only the doctor's office, but inside. I'd only seen Dr. Castillo twice before, so we were still new to each other. Still, he took one look and asked, "Why didn't you go to the emergency room? I'm happy to take care of you, but this should not have waited." "Doc," I was exhausted and sleepy like I've rarely ever been. That crazy woman who attacked me, I'm sure she had plenty of unsavory substances beneath her nails. As it is, I barely managed to make it to your office." He nodded. "Yep. Typical hard-headed old man. Much like me." He chuckled a little. "You know, you have a higher fever than should be the case with such a recent infection. And yes, the wounds are infected. We will need to—" A roaring noise supplanted his voice in my ears, and my vision shrank into a long gray tunnel, and then into the dark cave of unconsciousness. Well, eventually I either had to die or regain my senses. Apparently, I had accomplished the latter when my eyes fluttered open, and after a moment of gummy blur, I made out the face of a nurse and the bland, basic tones of a hospital room. "So how are we feeling, Mr. Brooks? Any better?" I know I must have looked confused. Could she not tell that I was confused? What was wrong with her? She'd been intelligent enough to pass her RN program, but why am I so angry? I wondered. Not like me to be angry at anyone for no real reason. Apparently she took my stupid, grouchy look to mean that I had no clue which I didn't. Sir, you lost consciousness in Dr. Castillo's office. He brought you over here to the emergency room. That was a few hours ago. You have infected wounds and a fever. Is there anyone you'd like us to call for you?" My throat was as dry as a Mojave, but I managed to croak out, "No, I live alone. Oh, wait. My dog, Lacy. Not sure whom to call." I realized I was in one of those awful hospital gowns. "Where's my phone? For that matter, where's my pants?" We eventually sorted out my belongings and clothing. Dr. Castillo had admitted me for an overnight stay for observation. Dr. Stone, meanwhile, had decided that she'd take a house call, collect Lacy, and keep her at the clinic overnight. She also contacted the sheriff's office and get them to check on the house overnight. What a sweet lady, I thought as I clicked off my phone. She texted me back before long and told me that she'd been unable to locate Lacy. She had looked and called but couldn't find her, so she set out some food and water and would wait another hour. I sent back that in addition to paying her fee that I'd like to take her out to dinner when I was back on my feet. I was surprised when she quickly responded that she'd like that. Lacy didn't show, and I quickly fell into a deep sleep. No dreams this time. I was cleared to go home the next morning. My fever had dissipated, and my welts looked to become an impressive set of scars about which I could tell lies. Brag. I was still weak, but I felt up to driving. I was worried about Lacy, and I couldn't believe that I'd asked Dr. Stone on a date. Wait, I equivocated internally. Just dinner. I stopped at the pharmacy for my new prescription of Cipro and some pain meds that I'd try to avoid taking. I kept my promise and picked up a box of Lacy's favorite treats. Hopefully she'll have returned. Likely just out exploring. I drove up towards the side of the house, and there she was, sitting on the front porch, tail pounding, all fear from the past days apparently wiped from her short memory. She looked different. Her fuzzy puppy hair had straightened, and she had apparently grown more. She definitely bulked up. The muscle definition along her front legs and the thighs of her back legs stood out clearly. She bounded towards me, and, as weak as I felt, I feared she might topple me. But she slowed at the last moment and reared up on her hind legs. She threw her front legs and paws around me and gave me an all-too-human hug. My dog had definitely become a stranger. Later that day, we plotzed on the sofa and watched TV. Not something we did too often. Not much worth watching, just dreck and drivel. Again with the grouchy, nearly angry thoughts. I still felt awful, and before I knew it, I awoke to late afternoon sun pouring through one of the living room windows. Guess TV was even more boring than usual, I thought as I blinked away the drowsiness. Oh, right, I mused. I took one of the prescription pain pills before I arrived home. The odor of something savory wafted in from the dining area. I creaked and groaned my way to my feet. Nothing unusual. Something always hurt these days. The muting effect of the pain medicine had worn off, and I was hurting enough that I feared that I would not die. Internal laugh. I got that one from Rhonda. There was a freshly heated microwave dinner on the table. Weird. I didn't recall getting up and making that. I looked over towards the front entrance. I really couldn't call it a door, since there wasn't one. Yet there was a nice sheet of heavy plastic over the damaged portal. The very piece from the garage I'd had in mind. Definitely didn't remember getting up to doing that. I considered the possibilities. 1, I was on more or better drugs than I realized. 2, I'd snapped. 3, a good Samaritan had come in and set everything up while I rested. Maybe Doc Stone? 4, the good folk, the Fae, had come at last and put up my door and made a meal for me. Now I'd have to put out milk and treats for them. I went with number 1 for the time being. I must have been semi-lucid. Maybe I'd taken another pill? No idea, but I was hungry. The infection had left me nauseous until I fell asleep on the couch. Now I was ravenous. I quickly devoured the meatball and pasta dinner, cleaned up, and then more closely inspected the temporary repair work on the front door. Yep, I realized. It had definitely been number 1. It was clearly the work of an intoxicated person. I guess that didn't rule out number 2. Still, it was weird. I'd never had a lost time episode. Good dope. I heard a rush of feet coming down the stairs. Lacy had run up while I consumed supper. I looked over to the table, and there she stood. Stood? Well, her front paws were splayed on the tabletop. Just a doggy lean. Whew, those painkillers. Odd that she'd taken to standing on her hind legs so much. She had been good about jumping on me only during play. Then today there was the hug, and now this. Dang, her front paws have gotten huge. Nails definitely needed trimming. Lacy, you know better. Down off the table. She looked at me, confused, then a little annoyed, before she dropped backwards onto her haunches and stared at me expectantly. "Thank you, dear lady," I said, and gave her a little bow. She gave me a radiant pooch smile. My reverie over the mysteries of my meal and the door repairs were short-lived. I took my evening dose and went up to bed. I heard Lacy trundle up behind me, but I didn't look at her. It was what I'd expected her to do, what she always did. At the top of the stairs, I felt the blood rush into my head, and I became suddenly dizzy. I snatched at the stair rail as I tumbled backwards. Then my fall was arrested, and I was gently pushed back onto my feet. I stumbled onto the top of the landing and looked back to see Lacy on her hind feet once again, now wearing a look of concern. She caught me and set me on my feet, I thought in astonishment, and almost experienced another head rush. "What's up with you, silly dog?" I murmured as I turned and shuffled down the hallway to my room. After a moment, I heard her feet padding along behind me. I awakened in a more lucid and energetic mood. Lacy gave me a quick sniff check and then trotted into the hallway on all fours. Must have been imagining things last night. Definitely some fine prescription dope. She likely had to go, and she would definitely be hungry, I realized. As I finished cooking breakfast and placed it on the table, I heard my phone give a text notification. It was Dr. Stone. "Lacy back yet?" I confirmed that she was, and that we'd be hanging around the house while I recuperated. She wished me well, and I wished her a good day at the office. When I finished typing, I looked up, and there was Lacy, seated in the chair at the other end of the table, grinning almost like normal, but she leaned back onto her haunches, her elbows bent upward and tucked to her side, her paws and claws drooping. There was something sinister about the way she looked at me. The grin was wicked and somehow familiar. Her ears had begun to point more, almost like they were cropped, and had they grown closer towards the crown of her head? She sat tall in the seat. Tall, not long. WTF, I thought in text language. I'd never thought or spoken in text language, but this had become a freak show. That does it. We're going back to see Dr. Stone, young lady. She just widened that awful grin and huffed a little. Not quite a bark, not quite a laugh. Yet no sooner did we get through the side door by the truck than she froze, much like the night she'd been attacked. She stared into the trees for a moment, then dashed out into the shadows of the morning, once more on all fours, but running with an odd gait, as though her front legs had grown faster than the rear. I called after her in vain, and after a while I decided to just go into town and see the good doctor without the dog. Maybe a good idea. Not sure what the other patient owners would think of her behavior. I wasn't that familiar with the locals. I'd only been up on weekends until late last year, when I'd pulled the trigger on retirement. I clambered in behind the wheel of my pickup and reached over the handle to close the door. That's when I heard an ear-splitting howl, higher pitched than the ones from the were-woman wolf, younger somehow, like those of an early adolescent compared to a grown person. Oh, Lacy, what have we gotten into? The next few months went by in a blur. The DA had declined charges, and there was only a brief mention in the news that Lacy Elbert had been found deceased. There was oddly very little said about it. In a small town, rumor gets around, but everyone had gone silent on the subject. At least I was off the hook. Our home had a new front door, but the faint odor of death still lingered, at least to my senses. Miriam, Dr. Stone to you, said it was just my imagination. The dinner date had gone well. As for Lacy, she grew, not only in stature but in strangeness. She spent most of her time roaming the vast timberland nearby. Yet she came back to visit occasionally. We knew it was her, despite the changes to her appearance. Miriam helped me with some online research. Lacy had become a dog man or dog woman. Many of those creatures were known to look ferocious, but still avoid harming people. Lacy was like that. We surmised that if a werewolf, a human who morphed at least partway into a wolf, part of the family Canis, because it was infected, then perhaps a dog, already a member of Canis, would morph partway into human under the same circumstances. Perhaps one capable of making a microwave dinner and completing a temporary repair? Nah. Option 1 it was, and well, had to be. Miriam and I sat out on the front porch, drinking iced tea and relaxing in the evening shadows. I'd just finished crooning that old standard, by the light of the silvery moon. She'd just have to get used to that, though she didn't seem to mind too much. In fact, she wiggled a little closer. From the near distance, a deep-throated howl sounded, a hunting howl. Shortly, from within the tree line, we saw a pair of red glowing eyes, about 6 feet off the ground. The silhouette of a canid with sharp ears at the top of her head appeared, and then the lean, muscular figure emerged into the waning light and stalked towards the porch. Reddish-blonde fur gleaming, sweet Lacy approached, her tail wagging, and the sinister yet friendly smile spread across her features as she approached us. She'd become a large, fearsome being, yet she dropped to all fours and gave each of us a doggy kiss. Oh, that breath! So quoth this raven. This is such a fun story, my darlings, that I did it twice. The first time I did it, I lost the audio, but it was so good I had to share it with you. Very fun little story. I do hope you enjoyed it. I so enjoy your visits to my chateau. And special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, and of course, Charlotte Emerson and Cortez Williams.